I'll try to give you here just a brief introduction to the chronology of the war and just what's happening to Hitler and the Third Reich and the Nazi Party through this war. First of all, you're looking at statistics from casualties, dead and missing. These are military casualties in the Second World War in Europe. So this doesn't include the Pacific. Um, we estimate that overall, um, probably around 50 to 60 million people were killed in the Second World War, both in Europe and the Pacific, and around maybe as many as 40 to 50 million just in Europe itself. So you're looking at military casualties. I think one of the first thing that will strike you is, especially if you kind of watch American World War II movies that almost imply that the Americans won the Second World War by themselves. American casualties in Europe is 170,000 dead. Rather a minor number when you compare to German casualties, 3,250,000, or Russian Soviet casualties, 13 million killed. And as Russians to this day, especially kind of the nationalist movement that the current president, Vladimir Putin, leads, will remind people, Westerners, that the Second World War was won with British stubbornness, American money and ingenuity, and Russian blood. Indeed, 13 million out of 19 million military casualties were Russian or Soviet. Ukrainians, Belarusians, all the various ethnicities that fought in the Soviet Red Army. And that number you're looking at is a low ball number. I prefer to often give kind of low ball statistics as opposed to the higher end statistics. And it's a lower number because, of course, the Soviet Union is embarrassed by the incompetence that leads to so many Soviet deaths. So they actually underestimated the casualties. Some higher end casualties suggest there could have been as many as 20 million Soviet military deaths. Many of those deaths are as a result of deprivation in those POW camps where Russian POWs are just kept in starving conditions in open air enclosures, starved to death, as well as POWs routinely murdered in death camps as well. So that partly raises the number. We see, for example, 300,000 Yugoslavian military deaths, 120,000 Polish military deaths, and so forth. So the Germans, of course, after the Russians, suffer the highest number of casualties, and most of those are on the Eastern Front as well. Civilian dead, not including the Jews of Europe, we see again nearly 3.5 million Germans, and again 6 million Russian civilians. And again, that number is also believed to be underestimated. It could be as many as 10 million Soviet civilian deaths. Poland, you can see 2.5 million civilians. Again, this is not including citizens of Jewish faith. So 2.5 non-Jewish Polish civilians murdered by the Nazis. 1.3 million Yugoslavians, mostly ethnic Serbs, that are murdered by a Croatian puppet government in under German occupation, which of course will then kind of raise its head in the 1990s when we have the wars in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia in the 1990s, as all these acts of genocide. Essentially, it's a kind of payback on top of payback on top of payback, and of course the last kind of genocidal process there was occurring, as I say, under the Nazis. So that accounts for the 1.3 million dead in Yugoslavia. And then if we look at just Jews killed in a Holocaust, this is the high end number of 5.9, nearly 6 million here. This is kind of the formal official number, but again, in addition to that, 6 million Jews, civilians, murdered in all these European countries. So when we add it all up, again, lower end statistics for the soldiers and civilians, 19 million plus 14 million plus 5.9 million, we're roughly at 40 million people killed in a span of approximately 5 years between September of 1939 and May of 1945. I'll now just take you through the war. This is like the war in half an hour. Uh, I'll start off by just reviewing with you the territorial expansion of Adolf Hitler in the 1930s, in the various ways that he had done it without formally going to war. We can see that March 13th, 1938, Hitler annexes Austria in the Anschluss. October 38 to March 39, he takes Czechoslovakia and he incorporates Slovakia as a puppet state. And then September 1st, 1939, he'll invade Poland. And that's the formal beginning of the Second World War. Although, again, as I pointed out, it actually begins in 1937 when Japan invades Manchuria. But for all intents and purposes, we still kind of look at the Second World War as beginning September 1st, 1939 in Europe. Then, of course, September 17th, the Soviets take their half of Poland, and that kind of ends the Polish campaign. By October, Poland has fallen and it's incorporated into the German Reich. The Soviet Union then goes to war in November of 39 with Finland, and it doesn't go very well for the Soviets. In the meantime, in June of 1940, the Soviets will annex what became independent countries after 1919. They were part of the Russian Empire prior to that, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. So that's by June of 1940. And we have this period now described as the phony war, or as the Germans would describe it, the Sitzkrieg, the sitting war, where France and Britain and Canada have declared war against Germany, but there's really not much combat going on. Neither country has deployed troops into Poland to defend the Poles. They're just waiting to go to war, although there are some air raids, there are some naval skirmishes. But essentially, on the ground, the war is kind of, as they described, a phony war was the term. It's been declared, but nobody's shooting at anybody. And in the meantime, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria become Nazi allies as well. So you're beginning to see how certainly by the spring of 1940, the Nazis now have this block of allies, including Italy as well. So already, without having really fought any major ground battles with the French or the British. The Americans are still remaining neutral at this point. Already, the Germans have a very powerful position on the European continent. April 1940, the Germans now preempt a British plan to invade Norway. The reason the British want to invade Norway is because Sweden is transshipping military grade iron ore through Norway. The British, to intercept this supply, are ready to actually invade Sweden as well. However, Norway is first on their agenda, but as the British in April of 1940 are massing their forces to land in Norway, Hitler preempts them and takes Denmark and Norway now in April of 1940. And this, of course, is when the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, steps down, and now Winston Churchill will be appointed Prime Minister. He's not exactly elected. um, there's a kind of a consensus in the British Parliament that Winston Churchill now will lead the new government, and he becomes Britain's famed wartime prime minister just in time for May 10th, when Germany invades now all this major territory. They invade France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, a tiny, as they call, postage sized country on the border of Belgium and Germany. The French very quickly surrender and join the Nazis. The Nazis reward the French by allowing the French to keep a territory under their own administration, which becomes known as Vichy France in the light green color. The French are also allowed to keep Morocco and Algeria, their former colonies. Italy, in the meantime, is invading Albania. And as well, Italy is moving into Tunisia in North Africa. So by the summer of 1940, the Germans now occupy all of continental Europe and are beginning to now cast their eyes towards the United Kingdom, the last country left standing, essentially, in Western Europe. The Germans launch a bombing campaign of Britain in July, September of 1940 that becomes known as the Battle of Britain. This is intended to soften the British up for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's plan to invade Britain. And of course, it goes very badly for the Germans. They fail. And again, I don't have really time here to get into details why. There's lots of reasons, but essentially it's a failure. This is the only kind of strategic battle, I think, in history fought in the air, and the British end up essentially prevailing in the Battle of Britain. Parallel to this, the British are also now fighting in North Africa against the Italians. The British, launching their attacks from Egypt, push the Italians back across Egypt, Libya, back into Tunisia. And at this point, Hitler deploys the German army, the Africa Corps, into North Africa under Rommel to help the Italians, and then they push the British all the way back across Libya, out of Tunisia and back into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, the strategic waterway for the British. And it's at El Alamein here that eventually the British Eighth Army under Field Marshal Montgomery will stop the Germans and begin to push the Germans back across North Africa, pending eventually a landing of American forces in Algeria and Morocco. But that hasn't happened yet. So the war is now being fought simultaneously in North Africa. You also have to remember that the longest battle fought or campaign in this war is the Atlantic campaign, the Battle of the Atlantic, a submarine warfare. Every one of those dots, I think, represents a either 1,000 or 10,000 tons of shipping sunk by German submarines. And we can see that between September of 1939 and March of 1941, the ships, cargo ships coming from Canada. Roosevelt, of course, under Lend Lease, is supplying Britain, even though the United States is neutral. Roosevelt certainly is pro-British, anti-Nazi, but Congress, of course, will not approve a declaration of war or American participation in the war. That's not going to happen until the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. But in the meantime, the Americans and Canadians, of course, are supplying Britain with all sorts of weapons and supplies. And we can see how all these submarines are sinking ships primarily in the Irish Sea as they're coming across the Atlantic from North America. March, December, the sinkings now move into the mid Atlantic. And of course, once the Americans are in the war after December 7th, 1941, we begin to see how German submarines now begin sinking ships off the American coast, off of Cuba, in the Gulf of Mexico, off of Texas, Galveston, off of Central America, Mexico, and so forth. In fact, people on Coney Island in New York can see transport ships burning on the horizon as German submarines are sinking them. And eventually, we can see these submarines enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So that is roughly the Battle of Atlantic, really the longest battle of the war, and critical strategically, of course, in keeping the European armies, the Allied armies, supplied on the Western Front in Europe. Once the Battle of Britain fails, Hitler now begins to retool his strategy. And for, I guess he kind of reread his own book, Mein Kampf, and remembered that he had planned to increase Lebensraum, living space in Eastern Europe. He now gives the general staff to draw up a plan for the invasion of Russia. This becomes known as Operation Barbarossa. Hitler has read his history books, and he's aware of what happened to Napoleon in 1812, how Napoleon managed to fight his way all the way into Moscow. He found it very easy to get into Russia, but once the winter comes, Napoleon found himself trapped in Moscow and essentially had to fight his way out of Russia through the winter. And as easy as it was to get into Russia, it wasn't very easy to get out. Napoleon barely managed himself to survive his Russian campaign in Russia. And so Hitler plans to invade Russia in May, knowing hoping that, planning that he'll be in Moscow by September, October before the heavy colds come. However, things go wrong. The Italians now choose to invade Greece, and they don't do very well against the Greek army. The Greeks essentially start pummeling the Italians. The Italians find themselves bogged down in danger of being defeated by the Greek army. And so Mussolini now begs Hitler to come to rescue him. Hitler, to get to Greece, needs to go through Yugoslavia. He asks the Yugoslavian monarchy permission to cross through Yugoslavia. The monarch gives the Germans permission, but the Yugoslavian army, which is mostly dominated by Serbs, who are very nationalist, and of course, remember their old kind of hostilities with the Austro Hungarian Empire, overthrow the king. And now the Yugoslavs say that they're not going to let Hitler come through Yugoslavia to attack their Greek neighbors. And of course, you don't say no to Hitler. Hitler now has to take German troops and tanks offline as they're preparing to invade the Soviet Union and bring them down to invade Yugoslavia. And so, April 6th, instead of finalizing his thrust into the Soviet Union, Hitler invades Yugoslavia. And there he sets up a puppet regime under the Croatians, encouraging this kind of ethnic hatreds in Croatia, in Yugoslavia, in Serbia, going back, at least a good 600-700 years. The Nazis, of course, as they did in other places, kind of use local racial hatreds to turn one group against the other. But it means that by the time Hitler is ready to, and by the way, then Hitler has to fight his way into Greece as well throughout May of 1941. And there, of course, he goes to war with the British in Crete and in parts of Greece. And so by the time Hitler is finished conquering Yugoslavia and Greece, it's now June, and Hitler is late behind in his schedule, and that essentially is the kiss of death for what's going to be Operation Barbarossa. He never will manage to capture Moscow as he planned before the codes hit. So, in a strange way, we can thank really the Greek army for winning World War II for us in a kind of circuitous way. Had the Greeks not pinned down the Italian army, Hitler would have gone on to invade the Soviet Union early as he planned, and who knows, we can speculate how that would have turned out. Instead, Hitler launches this invasion on June 22nd, 1941. I see the date there is May, but it should say June 1941, June 22nd, 1941. Finland also joins the Nazis, becomes a Nazi ally. They invade from the north. The Bulgarians, Romanians, Hungarians as well invade at the southern point, and then three German army groups thrust into the Soviet Union. It's a surprise attack that occurs overnight. This is probably the largest invasion in human history. 3 million troops. The distance from the northern combat to the southern combat is about equivalent to the distance from roughly Toronto to Vancouver. So we're talking, thousands of miles. Like I say, 3 million troops. It is the largest invasion in human history, the largest military operation ever. And the Germans basically just roll over Russian defenses. Hitler himself says, all we'll need to do is just kick in the door, and the whole rotting edifice will collapse around itself. And it certainly looks that way. As the Nazis do kick in the door, Russian troops are surrendering by the hundred thousands. Entire Russian army groups surrender. The Germans will just drive these prisoners into these open air camps with sticks. Surrenders occur at a level, 100,000, 150,000, 300,000, just these unparalleled surrenders. And of course, again, Russian POWs will have no benefit of the Geneva Convention, and they'll end up in these SS POW camps. The German army doesn't even keep them as POWs in the way they do British or French soldiers or American soldiers they capture on the Western Front. And there you see how prisoners are just left out in the open, and they eventually start cannibalizing each other. That's how bad it gets. Much to the surprise of the Germans, much of the population, especially in the Ukraine, which has always been seeking independence of Moscow for centuries, the Germans are greeted as liberators. I mean, Stalin was a monster himself. He certainly was much more indiscriminate in who he victimized as opposed to Hitler. And so a lot of peoples under the Communist Party, under Stalinist Russia again, particularly in the Ukraine, welcomed the arrival of the Germans as liberators. Here you see Ukrainian peasant women offering the traditional offering of bread and salt in friendship. Peasant girls are making sandwiches for the German army. And so a lot of Ukrainian nationalists think that the Nazis are going to allow them to have an independent state, not realizing what the Nazi plans really are. And that's how, of course, the Germans end up building all these foreign legion troops, including those Travniki concentration camp guards, kind of from nationalist factions among Ukrainians and Estonians, Lithuanians, Latvians, who are all have aspirations for sovereignty and believe that the Nazis are going to encourage that and participate in some of the Nazi atrocities by virtue of that. Of course, real life administration in these territories is completely different. Hitler intends to enslave the population, and anybody who can't work as a slave is going to be murdered. And so, as the Nazis begin to deport masses of Russian, Ukrainian civilians into slave labor, as POWs begin to escape those horrendous camps and bring back word of what happens if you surrender, as Germans begin hanging at random, civilian population, ethnic cleansing in the countryside, a resistance now begins to build up, and POWs, Russian soldiers, stop surrendering, and many begin to join the partisans, the guerrilla movement. And so there will be huge guerrilla movements now, commanded essentially by the Russian army staff. They become kind of an auxiliary arm under the command of the Soviet General Command. And these massive partisan armies now begin attacking the Germans from behind their lines in the form of guerrilla warfare. And all this begins, these acts of sabotage, assassination, begin to slow down the German advance as well. And so there's a big debate inside the German administration as to how severe the Germans are going to be with the local population. For example, Alfred Rosenberg believes that the peoples should be given some level of sovereignty as a kind of commonwealth countries in the Third Reich, while guys like Hitler, Himmler believe that they have this racial agenda that everybody should be enslaved and all excess population murdered, and they prevail. As I said, Alfred Rosenberg really never gets very far as the minister for Eastern occupied territories. Himmler really takes control. And of course, that's where the final solution will be executed in these territories. So throughout the summer, and the Germans are advancing at a very, very fast pace. Despite that, as I say, October of 1941, the Germans have suffered 750 to 800,000 casualties. 700, nearly 250,000 killed. That's an extraordinary number if you think about casualties today. I mean, over a 12-year period fighting in Vietnam, the United States had received 52,000 casualties. This is 750,000 casualties, and the Germans are winning. So the starting line again was here, June 22nd. By July, they're aiming towards Moscow, is the general target. By July, the Nazis have occupied all this territory. By September, they've reached this territory. And they could have pushed all the way to Moscow. However, Hitler begins to get bothered by this kind of salient that you see here. And so he insists that before he stops the advance against the recommendations of his generals, and insists that they now, instead of driving east towards Moscow, they now drive south and north and crush this salient in here rather than going to Moscow. And so that's perhaps the second critical mistake that Hitler will make in this whole history, because once they crush this salient and time comes to finish off Moscow, make the final push, becomes known as Operation Typhoon. They're going to be late now, and we'll see how things go bad. This is the position that the Germans reach the furthest, most territory they will conquer. Again, the date there says June 22nd, but that was the starting date. We're looking at it around by December of 1941. You can see the Nazis have actually reached the gates of Moscow. In fact, if Moscow was Toronto, the Germans reached around Islington Avenue and Airport Road. Essentially, they reached the suburbs of Moscow, and were if there wasn't anything standing in between them, they were like a half an hour drive from the Red Square, if there was no traffic. But they get not an inch further. They're going to be stopped literally in the suburbs of Moscow. And how that happens, of course, is a combination of things, starting with being late in the invasion at Moscow. They're stopped on the night of December 5th, December 6th, 1941. As well, around this time, the Germans as well start the siege of Leningrad. This is a 900-day siege, nearly 3 years, one of the longest sieges in modern history. over 1 million people will just starve to death in Leningrad as the Germans surround that city, as they say, for 300, for 900 days, not 300 days, 900 days, nearly 3 years. So what happens? As I say, the Germans are were enjoying this summer campaign. Things were going well, but in September, a gentle rain starts to fall. It starts, yeah, they're enjoying it. They're kind of cooling off from the summer heat, happily driving their vehicles through the mud. But the rains don't stop. They just keep coming and coming. And of course, asphalt is not a word in the Russian vocabulary of the 1940s. Most Russian roads are still dirt roads. And the rains are kind of seasonal, almost monsoon like rains. So there's even a word in Russian, vyazma, for this kind of phenomenon when roads just become these rivers of mud. And so gradually the German army starts sinking in this kind of quicksand mud that all the roads turn into. Their horses are sinking right up to their flanks. And again, it's a myth that the German army was kind of so super motorized. In fact, the German army was one of the least motorized armies of the Second World War. The German army used primarily horses to move its men, transport its vehicles, transport its artillery guns, its supplies, and so forth. Horse was the major way of transport, and these horses are just sinking in the mud. And their advance has suddenly crept to a slow start. And then suddenly overnight in early October, the earliest winter in Russian history, not only the earliest, but the coldest they ever had since they kept records, hits um, the entire area on the way to Moscow. This becomes known as General Winter in the way that the mud becomes nicknamed General Mud. This is something that neither side, neither the Red Army nor the German Army, had anticipated or planned. And so all that mud suddenly freezes. It's like concrete now. And all those vehicles that the night before were up to their axles in mud are now in frozen mud as the temperatures unexpectedly drop in October below freezing. The Russian winters very comparable to the Canadian one, and so we don't really get below freezing weather in October yet, and neither do the Russians, but they do in 1941. Indeed, it's almost as if God is on the Soviet side. Certainly, the weather is, and of course, Hitler had already anticipated being in Moscow by October. They hadn't planned on supplying winter uniforms to the army, and so everything grinds to a halt. For example, lubricant in the tanks, in the gun turrets, is it's not a winter grade lubricant, and so machine guns all seize up. The guns seize up as kind of summer grade lubricant begins to coagulate and freeze. Germans find themselves in their summer uniforms, completely without any kind of warm clothing. And so the German army essentially now begins to slow to this kind of freezing halt at the gates of Moscow. And now, the 6th of December is when the Russians choose to counterattack. Part of this is the work of the Russian intelligence or a spy, Richard Sorge. He's a German national working for German intelligence in Japan, and he assures the Russians that the Japanese have no plan of invading the Soviet Union, even though the Japanese are German allies. This gives the Soviets some sense of confidence to deploy troops they would have held in reserve in case Japan invades from their side, to now deploy these troops at Moscow. And so, completely unexpectedly, now the Germans are hit by this Russian counterattack. And of course, the Russians have experienced winter warfare with the Finns. In fact, they learn a lot about fighting in the winter from getting essentially quite badly beaten by Finland back in 1940. And so now you have all these Russian troops that are adapt to the snow. They also bring in troops from Siberia as well, who kind of grow up in the cold and know kind of how to work in the cold as well. Russian horses, of course, are used to working in the cold. German horses, they all come from kind of temperate regions of Germany. They're great for hauling, beer. Those German horses are great for transporting supplies in France, in Russia in the summer. But once the winter comes, the cold often constricts the arteries in German horses, unused to the cold, and German horses have heart attacks and coronaries and collapse from the cold, while Russian horses brought up in that cold happily prance their way through the snow as they attack the German lines. Russians themselves, of course, are a kind of a winter people with winter traditions. Crawling on your belly through the snow for Russians is kind of a form of recreation. If you know Russian traditional saunas, people go, into a sauna naked. They take a couple of shots of vodka, get all sweaty. They take a beating with kind of birch branches, and then they run out into the snow and roll naked in the snow. I mean, that's what Russians do, as I say, for recreation. So crawling into the snow to kill Nazis is just another day of recreation for the Red Army at this point. And so, for the first time, we begin to see a German army not defeated or destroyed, but stopped in its tracks. This has never happened. This is, as I say, it's not the destruction of a German army, but it is a setback, as Hitler now is stopped in the gates of Moscow, and for the first time, you see German troops surrendering and becoming POWs, or just like these three guys, just going to sleep and freezing to death in the field. And so Hitler now essentially meets with the general staff and begins to retool his strategy for Russia. Operation Barbarossa is now over, it's finished, and essentially it can't be called a success. It's not exactly a failure, but certainly it didn't achieve its objective of bringing down the Soviet regime and pushing the Soviets out of European Russia on the other side of the Ural Mountains, which divide Soviet Asia from European Asia. That didn't happen, and Hitler fails to capture Moscow, which would have been such an important propaganda and symbolic um, gesture, and fails to take Leningrad as well. And so Hitler now retools. He decides that once the weather clears in the spring of 1942, he's going to focus now on the south of Russia. He's going to push towards the oil and wheat wealthy areas around the wheat, of course, is in here, as well as coal mining, and of course, these vast oil reserves that are on the Caspian Sea, where Chechnya is today, the Caucasus. And so Hitler decides he's now going to push a second offensive, kind of Operation Barbarossa Part 2, into the south of Russia as the German lines in the north now kind of become static. So summer of 1942, we'll see the Germans pushing here. At the same time, in November of 1942, the Allies, the Americans and the British, land Operation Torch in North Africa, in Morocco and Algeria. They have to fight their way through the French army, which is defending the Germans. You know, the French were not our allies until the very last months of the war, except for the little group of French resistance that joined de Gaulle in London. And of course, once the Allies managed to defeat the French army at Morocco and Algeria, the Germans now occupy all of France. Vichy France now falls under German occupation. And now the Americans and the British start pushing at the Africa Corps in Tunisia. That's where Patton, of course, is fighting Rommel, while the British are coming in from the other side, and the Germans now find themselves squeezed in North Africa. So this is towards January of 1943. And of course, as this is happening in North Africa, you get what is the turning point of the war, the Battle of Stalingrad. This is considered, as I say, the point at which the fall of Nazi Germany will begin. It's the turning point battle where not only are the Germans stopped, but two German armies, the Fourth Panzer Army and the Sixth Infantry Army, are actually destroyed completely at Stalingrad. The Germans were pushing their way now through a very different, vast, empty terrain, wheat fields. They just went on forever. It was like fighting their way through a sea, except there's no fighting. Nowhere can they find the Russian army. It's just evaporated, and so the Germans are just pushing 1,000 miles into the depth of Russia. When they arrive at a town and city, they discover that the Russians had burnt it to the ground on the way out, scorched earth, leaving nothing for the Germans to use. The Germans have to get into these cities often, into bigger cities. And for the first time now, the Germans are finding themselves fighting inside cities. And of course, the Blitzkrieg, it's very effective out in kind of open, maneuverable fields. But once the Germans find themselves fighting house to house in the city, it's a completely different type of warfare in which the Blitzkrieg isn't of a lot of help. And so we find Germans now bogged down inside the cities for weeks and months sometimes, fighting their way through these densely populated areas. Eventually, they reach Stalingrad, and again, the Russians essentially withdraw, allowing the Germans to slip into Stalingrad. And so they again roll into this relatively modern, built up city, while the Russians withdraw. The city of Stalingrad, today known as Volgograd, is located on the Volga River. The Russians withdraw to the other side of the river and then dig in. And so this would be the Russian viewpoint of Stalingrad. And once the Germans get into Stalingrad, the Russians then launch a counteroffensive. They surround the city and suddenly cut off two German armies inside of Stalingrad. And then they begin to fight their way into this city. This is some of the heaviest urban fighting in history. It's fought not only house to house, but actually room to room. With, for example, the German army holding maybe the fifth floor of a building, while the Russians hold the sixth floor, and they fight for weeks up and down the staircases from room to room, sometimes on the same floor. Different armies hold different parts of the building. There's a huge tractor works. This is the tractor works are kind of like if you've seen the Ford factory in Oakville. It's this huge factory with assembly lines. They fight indoors. It's like an indoor paintball game, except they're using real munitions. They fight this battle indoors until they blow the roof off of the building. You can see Russians fighting with all this heavy body armor and flamethrowers, again, room to room, floor to floor. It's apocalyptic. And when it's done, this is the only thing that remains of Stalingrad. It's essentially reduced to rubble. Hitler orders his general von Paulus to hold firm. In fact, von Paulus at that point is a lieutenant general, the highest rank in the German army, short of field marshal, and Hitler promotes him to field marshal and reminds him that no German field marshal has ever been captured alive. In other words, he expects Paulus to commit suicide. Paulus, of course, refuses and ends up surrendering the German Sixth Army. It's a huge propaganda disaster and military disaster for the German army. Something like 500,000 to 750,000 German soldiers are taken off the battle order. It's a monumental disaster. Von Paulus will end up in the East German army afterwards. He also makes radio speeches against Hitler after his capture, while the Sixth Army and Fourth Panzer Army are now marched out of Stalingrad. And Hitler had plans to parade the German army through Moscow. Well, the Russians at least fulfill those plans. They parade the German army, except they're all POWs, through the streets of Moscow on their way to all these labor camps in which the German prisoners of war will now be used to rebuild everything that the Germans destroyed in Russia for nearly the next 10 years. In fact, for more than 10 years. The last German POWs will not return from Russia until about 1955. Russians will hang on to them until they're finished rebuilding many of the Russian cities that the Germans had leveled. So Stalingrad, as I say, becomes this turning point. The Russians begin pushing the Germans back. By July of 1943, there is this salient here, becomes known as the Kursk salient. Again, Hitler kind of is bothered by this bulge in the lines, and so in July of 1943, Operation Citadel is really the last major German counteroffensive on the Eastern Front. It's sometimes described as the largest tank battle in history until the Yom Kippur War of 1971 between Egypt and Israel and other Arab allies. However, there are historians who dispute that even this was the largest tank battle in the Second World War. However, it is a huge tank battle, and the Germans lose again. And that's the last time the Germans ever find themselves kind of on the offensive, July of 43 on the Eastern Front. From now on in, they'll just be on the defensive. At the same month, July 10th, 1943, the Allies land at Sicily and begin pushing their way into Italy. By September of 43, the Allies have landed in mainland Italy. And when they do that, the Italian government now arrests Mussolini and reestablish the monarchy, and they then surrender to the Allies. The Germans invade Italy at this point, the way they invaded their ally Vichy France, and now Italy comes under German occupation, and of course that seals the fate of the European of the Italian Jews who, while Mussolini was in power, of course, were discriminated against, but certainly were not being put to death by the Italians, by the fascists. Now, as the Nazis come into Italy, the Germans, they will put many Jews to death. Mussolini will be rescued by German commandos and will be put back in power in northern Italy. He'll just now be kind of a just an empty shell of what he once was. Leningrad is liberated January of 1944, ending the siege, the 900-day siege. And June of 1944, as the Allies had planned, the Russians now launch what is the largest military operation since Operation Barbarossa, Operation Bagration. This is a Soviet army now retooled, resupplied. They have lots of American supplies as well, and they just begin rolling over the German army as at the same time, June 6th, the Allies land in Operation Overlord at Normandy and open the Second European Front. And Germany now finds itself fighting essentially a three-front war. The Allies advancing through Italy from the south, advancing from the west through France, eventually Belgium, Netherlands, and of course the Russians advancing from the east. Now, there are all these resistance groups that rise up as well as Allies troops hit the ground. The Allies, of course, are parachuting supplies to them. So the Germans now, by June of 44, are really now under the gun. This, of course, is becoming problematic for Hitler, who continues making these terrible decisions. His staff now the generals are now beginning to take a second look at Adolf. He had seemed to have this kind of luck in the beginning, even though German generals were advising him not to do these things. He continued to make these moves, and at the beginning of the war, they were successful despite German advice, senior advice not to do that. Now, they're not so successful, but Hitler continues disregarding the advice of his generals, and the generals now begin to think maybe it's time for Adolf Hitler to go. And so, for those of you who might have seen the Tom Cruise movie Valkyrie, here he is, the real Tom Cruise, Stauffenberg. Stauffenberg is a colonel. He's Hitler's adjutant, kind of liaison to the German army. He had been badly wounded. He only has one arm and one eye. And he serves Hitler, as I say, during staff conferences at Hitler's bunker in East Prussia. And there's a meeting planned in that bunker that you see, concrete bunker that you see in the background. But at the last minute, unknown, the bunker is going to be moved because it's so hot that day, July 20th, 1944. The meeting is going to be moved into a wooden hut because it's so hot that day, and that's going to change a lot of things. Stauffenberg um, has a briefcase in which he has a bomb. It has an acid kind of fuse. So what Stauffenberg has to do is he has to carry this briefcase with the bomb in it into the meeting, put it under the table, map table, where Hitler and his generals are inspecting these maps. He has to, before he does that, he has to reach into his briefcase with his one good arm with a pair of pliers that he has inside the briefcase, and then use the pliers to break the sulfuric acid ampule that's on the fuse. And then as the acid begins to work its way in the fuse, eventually, after approximately 15 minutes, the acid works its way through a spring, which then detonates this bomb in this briefcase. It's a very complex plan. Um, German officers prior to the assassination could have worn their sidearms when meeting with Hitler. So any one of these brave German generals could have actually just shot Hitler down like a dog. And it just shows you how cowardly and wishy-washy even the German generals were. They have this really complicated plan, with a bomb that he's going to put under his table. Just, shoot the guy like a dog that he is. None of them dared to do this. And so Stauffenberg brings that bomb in, breaks the capsule, puts the bomb next to Hitler's feet as he's showing him on the map. And then Stauffenberg goes, "Oh, I have to make an important long distance telephone call to Berlin. Excuse me." And then he walks out of the room and waits for the bomb to go off. When the bomb goes off, it does all this damage, and Stauffenberg assumes that Hitler has been killed, and so he radios the code word Valkyrie out back to his co-conspirators. That signals that Hitler is dead, and German troops around Europe start arresting SS and Gestapo officers. The only problem is, of course, is that Hitler is not dead. Somebody during the meeting keeps tripping over the bomb, and so they pick the briefcase up and move it away to the other side of the table. And so when the bomb goes off, it wounds. That's the room. It wounds a lot of German officers. In fact, several of them die. But there are these kind of big bulkhead um, blocks of wood holding up the table. They offer Hitler protection. And so Hitler survives. He gets a pierced eardrum. He's going to be physically injured to some extent, but he survives. The only thing they manage essentially to assassinate is Hitler's pants. And so a few minutes later, Hitler comes out in a clean uniform, although you can see he's still in a state of shock. He see one of his buttons, he hasn't managed to button that tunic button. He's also now, you can see, gripping his hand. You can see he was injured on his other hand, and this hand will have tremendous tremors now. If you ever see old film footage of Hitler from 44 or 45, you see that often he takes this position because the tremors in his arm, he can't stop them anymore. Hitler ends up visiting some of the survivors. And of course, Hitler sees this as providence. God is on my side. And there's a number of assassination attempts that Hitler survives. This is, I think, that there's 20 assassination attempts on Hitler. He survives them all, including the July assassination attempt, or attempts and conspiracies, I should say. The Gestapo and SS now turn around and arrest all those people that were arresting them, and the conspirators and anybody else. Like, for example, remember, Schacht is now arrested, Papin is now arrested and accused of conspiring against Hitler. So anybody Hitler wanted revenge on, or who had slightest suspicion, so several thousand people are arrested. They'll be tried by one of the most notorious judges, a guy called Friesler. And there's film footage of Friesler just berating the defendants, calling them swine and so forth. They're forced to stand in front of the judge without belts on their pants. They're kind of holding up their pants with their hands, kind of in this humiliating pose. And they're sentenced to this horrific death. They're hung on piano wire from meat hooks. And legend had it that Hitler had these executions filmed and then watched the executions, although I never was able to confirm this story, and certainly never seen these alleged snuff films that Hitler is said to have done. But they are executed in this building that's a kind of monument to German opposition to Hitler. How much of this opposition is to Hitler as opposed to Germans thinking they can fight the war better than Hitler? We often forget that a lot of these German generals just thought that Hitler was mismanaging the war, and if we can kill Hitler, we can still win this war. So they're not exactly heroes in the sense that they want to bring peace to Germany. What they want to do is they want to eliminate Hitler's mismanagement of the war. And so we can perhaps some of the conspirators are no doubt longtime Nazi opponents, but there are others who join in simply because they think that with Hitler gone, they can maybe either negotiate a peace with the United States and Britain and go to war with Russia, finish the war with Russia now with Allied help, or at least negotiate some kind of honorable peace for Germany. So it really wasn't a question of opposition to necessarily Nazism. So again, an example perhaps of selective opposition. So as we get to September of 44, the Russians are now pushing into Poland. They've gotten to Warsaw. France is being liberated. The Allies are pushing into the Netherlands, into Belgium, and so forth. The Russians are now crossing into Hungary, towards Czechoslovakia. December of 44, Hitler attempts his one last counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. And after about 10 days, he literally runs out of gasoline. His army can't move further. He, of course, had a break in the weather, and so there was no air cover for the Allies, but the weather clears, and suddenly the Allied Air Force now begins to pummel the German army that has run out of gasoline. They failed to capture gasoline stores that the Allies had, and that is essentially the last German counteroffensive of any note, December of 44. And now there's about 5 months left to the war, as the Allies in 1945 all begin to push into Germany, and the last offensive begins in Italy itself. Eventually, the Americans will stop along this line here on the left, along the Elbe River, while the Russians will be left to finish off Berlin. And so they begin now to surround Berlin and secure all this German territory around Berlin, leaving Berlin for the last. Berlin now begins, you remember Goebbels is the Gauleiter. They begin mobilizing children and old men to defend the last vestiges of the Third Reich. Here we can see Hitler, who is now in Berlin, um, kind of giving iron crosses to these kids that are fighting him. This is among the last known pieces of film or photographs of Adolf Hitler. This is taken days before his death, as he urges these children to fight on to the death. And so essentially, you have these young teens and kids now fighting. They're the only ones that are left. Eventually, the Russians break into the city, and now they proceed to do to Berlin what the Germans had been doing for 2.5 years in Russia. They burn, loot, rape, kill anything that moves. The objective is ironically the Reichstag, even though the Reichstag is essentially non-functioning, but for the Russians, the Reichstag kind of is the ground zero symbol. And so as Hitler urges his army to fight to the death in Berlin, including those Indian troops from India, the Hindi Tigers, who are fighting now for Hitler in Berlin. He's urging his troops not to surrender. Any German who attempts to surrender is shot by his own soldiers or by the SS and Gestapo. The city will be almost entirely destroyed in this horrific battle. And eventually it comes down to the final battle in kind of the center of Berlin. And here you can see the Reichstag. Um, so as troops are fighting above the Reichstag, a few blocks away, deep in his bunker, Hitler is hiding out as the battle goes raging above him, as Antifa radicals are raging in the streets above. I love this bunker painting. It just reminds me of the last few weeks of Bunker Donald in his bunker. Um, and so Hitler now is just, as I say, hiding out in his bunker as the Russians are on the surface above. Hitler has brought his dog Blondie and his mistress Ava to the bunker. And so, in the last day, the end of April, Hitler now formally marries Ava Braun. And then they lock themselves in their room, and Hitler now proceeds to poison his dog, Blondie. The Russians will find the dog. This is the photograph of the dog released by the Russians in around 1968. They declassify this photograph. Imagine they kept this photograph of a dead dog secret from 1945 until 1968. And then Hitler and Eva lock themselves into their, or close the door in their private office, sit down on this couch, and they then commit suicide. Hitler, Eva bites down on a cyanide capsule. And then once Hitler sees that Eva has successfully committed suicide, Hitler either puts the gun to his head and simultaneously bites down on the capsule and shoots himself in the head, or and there's a lot of controversy about this, or once Hitler bites down on the capsule and kills himself, one of his adjutants comes by and shoots Hitler in the head to make sure he's dead. The witnesses, there's conflicting stories as to how many shots were heard, whether Hitler shot himself or just poisoned himself, and kind of this reputation, Hitler's reputation of kind of a heroic death where he shoots himself rather than poisons himself like a dog. But nonetheless, you can see the blood there. That's where Hitler's body was found by his German staff lying on that couch next to Eva. These are, of course, our American soldiers who are there about a week after the suicide, not knowing what happened to Hitler. Hitler's body is then taken out this door marked by the three X's. They're then put X into this pit, and gasoline is poured on their bodies and they're set afire, but they didn't have enough gasoline to perfectly cremate the bodies, and so they just bury these burned remains, which the Russians recover. And again, in 1968, when Churchill comes to see it, that place is then covered up. And the Russians don't tell the Allies that they actually found Hitler's body. It remains a mystery. It's only in 1968 that the Russians released these photographs of Hitler's body and Eva Braun's body in the condition they're found. They also released these photographs of Hitler's dental bridges by which they identified Hitler. And when I was a journalist working in Russia in the 1990s, after the fall of communism, the KGB opened its archives, and I actually got to see Hitler's head, which is kept in the archives in a paper bag. I wasn't allowed to film it, so these are not my photographs, but I was allowed at least to visit with Hitler's head and actually hold his skull in my hand. As I say, the KGB held it in its archives, and here you can see the top skull with the bullet wound and the kind of charring from the burning. And legend has it that Stalin was given the head and used it for a while as an ashtray. And indeed, if you turn the skull around, you can see these round burns as if somebody was stubbing out their cigar in Hitler's skull. So, maybe there is truth to that legend. Nonetheless, Hitler definitely was killed. They buried his body in Germany, and it's somewhere in the 1980s that they actually had dug up the Russians, the body, secretly and destroyed it in the 1980s, keeping only the skull that they had back in the archives. The body itself was destroyed in the 1880s. So all this stuff you see on History Channel, Hitler escaping, and there are all these allegations that that's not Hitler's skull, and so forth, are quite improbable. It's very probable that Hitler would have died of natural causes. Because of his health condition, he probably would not really have lived till 1946, even if he had won the war. He was in terrible health by then. He apparently had Parkinson's disease. He was addicted to a number of amphetamine type drugs. He was just falling apart. So the idea that Hitler lived on secretly into the 1950s or maybe even 1960s is just nonsense. He died in Berlin. Goebbels, as you might remember from my lecture on him, of course, now commits suicide as well. I mean, this kind of Gotterdammerung, killing his entire family. Berlin, shortly after Hitler's death, now falls. The Russians raise their flag over the Reichstag. That's the final victory. And shortly after that, Germany formally surrenders. Huge victory parade on the Red Square, May 8th. In fact, I think May 8th is Victory Day today in Russia. Huge celebration. All the captured German banners are dragged across, face down, the Red Square by Russian soldiers, and then they're flung at in front of the tomb of Lenin. And if you visit the Russian military museum in Moscow, the Red Army Museum, you'll see a huge display case with hundreds of these banners that are now on display, captured German banners in that museum. Berlin, of course, is completely devastated now, and Berlin will now be occupied, and Germany itself will be occupied, divided into four zones: Russian, British, American, and French zones. And Berlin will be likely divided as well. Berlin, of course, is deep where you see the red, deep inside Soviet East Germany. And of course, once the Cold War begins, a great wall will be built around Berlin, dividing East Berlin from the rest of Berlin. Berlin will become this kind of an island until 1989, when the Berlin Wall falls. So essentially, Germany, at least Berlin, will be under military occupation until 1989. 1961, the East Germans will raise this infamous Berlin Wall, dividing Berlin. And of course, it becomes the symbol of post war Germany, including Allied Checkpoint Charlie. City divided by this bizarre wall and kind of death strip in between.